compatibility between like using the practical application of inertia as a practical access between dimensional claws that represent, McDonald's golden arches of degree level reference standards of consensual participation as compared to the one cycle half above and below, and description of the U.S. $1 bill below the equator as Latin terminology. Yet the combine of it being practical application being side by side at a 90 degree, swimming upstream, like the misappropriation allocation of the Mississippi being ACTP colon. Yet, are you dyslexic? The colon, double forward slash, or, the idea of like, ratio, and what anatomy is and compatibility. Even in that way of a little bit of humor of dyslexia, yet symmetric asymmetry or intelligence and opposite, yet 115 of a telepathic faith, yet as 92 as the Pentagon Reserve Reverse, same of practical application, different alphanumerics, having some idea of the same meaning, and it seemed to be that it's going to be the word inertia and some access and transition between, even television programming, going beyond the thought of like a litigation de facto rich habeas corpus as monetary and domestic of neighborhoods. Yet my thing is really about, having and like living in and everything about, music, audio, music video, audio production, and not limited to, including, touring concerts and, entertainment venues, and as well as including television, like obviously like YouTube, already. But the thing with it is that, getting to my original music, it's like, get a little frustrating, like not cool thinking that, de facto being used as lifespan, some idea of like intellectual, having fair use, and maybe realizing something about a carbon footprint, and naivety of, trading energy, as a carbon footprint, or absentee voting, or, thought of like the difference between the North American Free Trade Act, and it seemed to be so Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt of the Roosevelt New Deal Act, and the International Electronic Engineering and OPEC identifying, the two of a PC-13 rating, even the two tablets of, Moses getting the Ten Commandments on two tablets, and right now it seems to be the thing even of me needing the thought of like a V-twin generator, and even the P representing the word peace is normally, people doing that, in the the late 60s with the peace sign representing the P in NATO. Yeah, I've seen it both with and without the P, and in either case, I've heard it pronounced as North Atlantic Peace Treaties Organization and pronounced as North Atlantic Treaties Organization. I've seen it with and without the P, but it's identifying the two of what, peace is in a symbolic representation that's identifying the two as Texas, New Mexico power, yet the North American Free Trade Act is presenting, the idea of like even terminology involving what is obviously the misappropriation allocation of the Mississippi, and how the U.S. dollar below the equator is described, and even Barack Obama's reference to Al-Qaeda, and it's ultimately getting to, the comparison, not really comparison, I don't even want to call it comparison, or compatibility of what is identified as the mammon in Latin terminology as the history of the U.S. dollar, or something of Barack Obama referring to trying to demonize you, and the similarities of the U.S. dollar identified as a mammon of that fact in his own words, yet a practical application identifying a Persian Gulf as the idea of Al-Qaeda, yet the misappropriation allocation of Mississippi below the equator is identifying Amazon, and all this information in the Nile and Euphrates, yet it presents the idea that the frequency of half above and below is identifying Latin terminology as, the delta force, and I can't just exactly just like, agree to like some subconscious thoughts, a persuasive technique of thinking, or redundant frequency of access of speakers, and what access means readily and available as some idea of just electronic equipment that's normally not identified as access any time, day or night, of, like surveillance. The thing with this is that normally identifying the thing about 8 ohms, and it is 8 ohms, all this other stuff that's been showing as 4 ohms, it would only be the thought of like pi r squared, or a vice president network as Vic's formula 44. And the similarities of the word hidden involving escrow. And ultimately, the 22 in Combine is seen to be automatically, the thing about the FDIC and RCA, and what's involved with redundant frequency, and the 8 ohms identifying even, the figure 8, and the alpha and omega, yet 8 ohms, the figure 8, representing at a 90-degree infinity on a zoom lens, a perfect 10-10 vision, involving linguistic analytics, linguistic alphanumerics, and symbolic and analytical, as reasoning as the MSN is of like one of like numerical or alphanumerical, and some analytical and symbolic, reasoning as a combine, based upon pronunciation. And that's really the way it is with like linguistic alphanumerics, based upon pronunciation more so. I'm not saying more so, it's just that really it really is. It's really not limited to, but based upon pronunciation as compared to a degree definition of intended use of the degree of where the definition is in the degree, not necessarily the thought of ambiguous and a multitude of definitions to one word. Yet it seems to present that as region 0 in binary numbers. Yet, the Boolean chart of digital audio, it presents 16 characterization in sets of 6. And, the numerical value of 6 being SIX is the alphanumerics of 52, and the acronym VPN, a Vice President Network, or Root 66. The thing of like pi r squared being 2 thoughts of 2 Vice President networks is Root 66, or the Star of David, the Israeli flag, being 2 Delta forces, or 2, electronic schematic symbols is 2 triangles, and what the Nile and Euphrates is in that way, and the monetary and domestic, and even, the thing about Texas New Mexico power, and getting the difference between the algebraic test of inversion of, Texas and Mexico not being the same region as the algebraic test of inversion of does not equal, yet numerically it looks that way. In another way, Mexico is not region 1, it's region 0 to the United States, like the Eurodollar is. Yet all that combined is like identifying region 0 of what and who is involved, all the way to Europe and the Statue of Liberty as compared to, what would be presented as Columbia pictures giving the impression of the Statue of Liberty. Yet it's not. I'm not Colombian. It's not that I have to be just because I'm in the bank. Yet it seems to be the factor of like knowing that the Mormon Church is like the American religion. Yet Utah, and the thing about Zion National Park, and Zion being the thing about U.S. Grover Cleveland on $1,000, and 1,000 years of peace, and what peace is to NATO Peace Treaties, North Atlantic Peace Treaties Organization, as relation of like North American Free Trade Act. All the stuff I'm talking about has been, some idea of motivation. I'm not limited to, I'm really about getting, the commercial venue, and getting, the annuity side of, not some idea of suppression and loss prevention as, litigation de facto original habeas corpus, as some idea of some subtracting values, a deduction, or some idea as a percentage that's not even equating to a full refund, removing the idea of a prepaid tax as a full refund of like non-taxable income, and completely annuity on a continental level that involves the ERISA statute, obviously, maybe even the Sarbanes-Oxley financial instruments of SOX compliance. The information, I'm looking for one word. Really, I'm not, but it got to the point in alphanumerics and linguistics that I almost had a automatic perception only because of the process of elimination and analytical reasoning and symbolic reasoning that gave me almost a perception, at least a direction of category, and I mean, at least, minimizing to at least a minimum of a category, But anyway, so like, all that's going on, and really, a whole new way of life is really, in my thought of like, phenomenally, like, really going to, like, say what I have to say, including the Hill HX-50 helicopter, which is another location I was actually taken to during the Stargate program. The actual location was the manufacturer in Great Britain. And I'm not sure if it's still in Great Britain, but the infomercial itself, and like one of the guys that's in the infomercial, it seemed to be the idea of the classroom, of what would be, a classroom setting. At the time, I mean, I had absolutely no idea where I was at, or what was involved, or, other than like, where am I at? Why am I here, And years later, watching YouTube, I'm looking at it the same time, I'm in the same setting, yet in Korea, of a uniform, olive-colored uniform, and a guy in uniform with a guitar. In the same setting, but a different view, it seemed to be, and I'm not sure if it's just made to be the same idea of Hill helicopter or something vertical in a way of quantum, identifying, Japanese in Pearland that way, of the structure that calculus does not have, and the different design E, and all this information, because, it's like trying to grasp and read as much about Sarbanes-Oxley, financial instruments of SOX compliance, and, the idea of some color code between, like, Chicago White Sox and the Boston Red Sox, and the thought of, like, amyloidosis, and a color code between the white blood cell and the red blood cell, yet baseball and the 90-degree automatic quadrant in the Oval Office of International Financial Management, even in the anatomy of the Oval Office, and automatically International Financial 90-degree, ultimately a quadrant of globalization, like one of the bigger words in like virtually every single International Financial Management, the word globalization being thought of the Oval Office there. I mean, really, in anatomy, I mean, the real relation of compatibility, yet, I mean, who you trying to kid on the toilet? I mean, globalization of, like, a toilet, and, the awful thing about it, I mean, in any case, this really identifying, information involving international financial management will ultimately get to, manure, and tracing it to the outhouse of globalization, and backtracking it, getting to the thought, of Commonwealth, and what that seemed to be of, like, digestion, Reader's Digest, and what it means on the toilet. Commonwealth is common knowledge of information based upon, I don't really like calling it demographics, but, sometimes geographic is a huge factor, of whether the thing about knowing the difference, or having availability and access in that way, or boundaries and limitations of some idea, presenting duration of limitations and access. In any case, like, it's already going on 50 minutes, okay? And I'm keeping all that in mind because it has significance, and really kind of like, really about getting above, and my thought of, maybe something beyond even the 12-photo reserve range, or the categorization of money, and beyond the thought, boundaries and limitations based upon a category of money. Yeah, I'm really about some real serious, electronic power, of electronics, beyond the thought of paper or method of banking. Yeah, and like, so like I'm really about getting and having quite a bit that this information seems to be significant. I mean, ignoring it and thinking that it's insignificant is probably generations already born in to what is already a known fact, except it's just a birth year seemingly involving what seemed to be like my birth year of 1964, and a combine of 1964 being 83, like a winner. But the thing of it is that even the Social Security Administration's last four of the telephone number, way down here, 772-12 and 13. Ultimately gets to 12 and 13 being L&M, Lockheed Martin, in legal media. Excuse me, and including getting to 64 and 65, yet ultimately, 83 and 84. And the issue of McDonald's Golden Arches, upper degree level local standards of consistent participation, and the one frequency half above and below, identifying Latin terminology in the book Secrets of Civil Alphabets that runs the country. There's some idea of what is identified as a grid, obviously of neighborhoods, and how a boycott embargo seems to be the thing of more so of neighborhoods, of monetary and domestic, and methods of holding, methods of banking, clearance, national security, and about getting above all that, and like getting about being national security of annuity, and having a mega multi-billionaire millionaire way of living, and this is what I have to say about it on YouTube.com on Wade SV Pretty PRDDY, because it seemed to be, everything that matters about degrees and academic, to me it'll always be degree brands and what available only means in relation. And if that's just like happen to be all there all at once at the same time, well good, or some idea manufactured of like maybe recognizing a whole new perception, so like in any case, so there's something that a whole new idea of like annuity as compared to settlement, all that information, so like anyways, it's going on and on and on, and like really I need to take a break, and I think I'm gonna do that like right now anyway. There it is, and alright, great, there it is, yeah.